For the last 2 generations or so, all of us have grown very comfortable with the text that we use to celebrate the liturgy. Now in the United States, in fact in the rest of the English-speaking world, we are preparing for the most significant change in the liturgy since the introduction of the new order of Mass back in 1970. And as you know, if you read the newspapers and follow the blogs, the response has been somewhat mixed to the changes. Response to the change comes from a number of different sources. Sometimes we become so comfortable with the familiar that to change becomes an annoyance. We have to learn new ways of saying things. Our routine is broken, and so there's some natural resistance to change. The 19th century spiritual writer, Father Faber, captured this feeling when he said, "All change is for the worse, even when it's for the best." There are other times that we don't have sufficient knowledge for a change or changes, and so we may be somewhat hesitant to embrace what lies ahead. And then, thirdly, if we're honest, there are times when we must realize that not all change is progress, and what we change to may not be better than what we already have. Hopefully, as we share some of these thoughts this afternoon or this morning and this afternoon, we can explain some of the history, some of the purpose, some of the actual changes in the new text of the Mass, and in some ways answer some of these ill feelings or uneasiness that some people may still have about the new text. First, change in general. In a word, life is not static. Faber's contemporary, Blessed John Cardinal Newman, said, as you know, to live is to change, to be perfect is to have changed often. To be alive is change. This applies to people, it applies to institutions, it even applies to language. Liturgy is people. Liturgy is life, and therefore liturgy changes. It might be helpful to understand some of the reasons why we are changing now. Why are we given new texts at this moment? Well, back in the year 2000, Blessed John Paul II announced the publication of a 3rd edition of the Roman Missal, a new edition of the Latin text that is used throughout the world in the Roman Rite. And the reason why they did a new edition is because they were adding certain things to the edition that we used already. There were prayers for the observance of feasts, memorials of recently canonized saints, additional prefaces for the Eucharistic prayers, additional masses and prayers for various needs and occasions. So once that 3rd edition of the Roman Missal was published in Latin, it became the official text to be used throughout the world. Hence the need of the conferences of bishops to prepare vernacular translations. The fact that a new missal requires a new translation is easily understood. But what poses a problem for some is that the new translation has taken place on basis of principles that are different from the ones that were used in translating the prayers we now use. And as a result, our new liturgical text will sound very different. It is good to remember at the beginning that we've only been using the vernacular in the Mass for about 2 generations. This means that the translation of liturgical texts from Latin into English has had a relatively short history in a church that's 2,000 years old. In these 2 generations or so of using English, as you would expect, we've learned a number of things in the process. Since the Second Vatican Council, we have learned more about the sources of the texts we use. We've learned a little more about the structure, and we've even learned a little more about the art of translation from Latin into English or French or whatever. It is inevitable that based on these new understandings, the translations would have to be revised. Now, when the Second Vatican Council took up the question of the liturgy, the bishops in attendance did something unprecedented in the history of our church. For the very first time, an ecumenical council examined the liturgy, an essential part of the church's life, in all its aspects, biblical, theological, as well as pastoral. And the council gave great importance to the liturgy by making the first document that it published Sacrosanctum Concilium, the document on the liturgy. If you read through that document, the golden thread that unites everything together, what is it? It is the full, active, conscious participation of the laity in the liturgy. And so the change from Latin into English was meant to facilitate that active participation. In 1969, the Holy See's Concilium issued an instruction called Como le Prevoit, and that laid down the rules on how Latin was to be translated into English. From 1969 to the year 2000, that document granted translators a rather wide latitude in translating liturgical texts. And rather quickly, in the English-speaking world, translators adopted what is called the method of dynamic equivalency to translate the Latin. What does that mean? Simply stated, dynamic equivalency translates concepts and ideas from one language to another, but not necessarily the literal words, phrases, or expressions. And the overriding principle in dynamic equivalency is to make the text totally accessible to the listener. And at times that takes precedence over other considerations. When that document was issued and provided those principles for vernacular translation, that document also did something else. In the very first paragraph, and this was often forgotten, in the very first paragraph of that instruction back in 1969, the Holy See said, after sufficient experiment and passage of time, all translations would need a review. And so back in 1976, ISIL, the International Committee on English in the Liturgy, began a very careful process of reviewing the text that we were using. The committee took in both the positive and negative observations, and they looked at the suitability and the proclaimability of the text that we were used in liturgy. This process of re-examining the text and their use, this process of consolidation went on for about 20 years. And it included research into where the texts were coming from. It looked more into the scriptural and patristic basis for the prayers that we're actually using. In addition to the work that ISIL was doing in evaluating the text we were using, the Congregation for the Divine Worship and the Discipline of the Sacraments in Rome also began to reevaluate the principles that were used in translation. And at the same time that they were examining the principles that had been used, they were also initiating the work on a new edition, the third edition of the Roman Missal. And then as a result of these years of study and collaboration, in the year 2001, the Holy See came out with a new document on how to translate liturgical works. And that document was called Liturgiam Authenticam, the instruction on the use of vernacular in the publication of books of the Roman liturgy. This document intended to redefine some of the principles, but also to replace some of the principles that had been used. The instruction no longer espoused dynamic equivalency as the mode of translation, but rather formally approved formal equivalency. And what that means is now to be a greater attention to the actual words and phrases and the order in which they are found in the original. The new document set principles that put a greater emphasis on retaining the scriptural and patristic allusions in the text, not whitewashing them out so that it could be more easily understood. The new document also emphasized a recapturing of the rich vocabulary of the liturgy that had been lost in the previous translation, and it said that grammar, syntax, rhetorical forms, and word order should be followed insofar as it is possible in the English language. This new instruction did not deny the necessity of making the text accessible, but it did refocus translators. So now they had as their work ahead unearthing the theological and linguistic richness of the original Latin text. Not just concepts, but words and expressions, and we'll see this in some of the examples. Words and expressions were to be translated faithfully. And this approach unearths for us, gives us the treasury that is so important in the Roman Missal. Now, some people find this kind of exactness in translation a little bit disconcerting, but there is a gain, and we should recognize it. This new emphasis adds a balance that prevents us from having an impoverishment of the language that we use in liturgy in terms of our biblical and liturgical tradition. And here is something that I'd like to point out from the very beginning as we look at some of this. The new instruction, Liturgiam Authenticam, had as its purpose something much wider than a new translation of liturgical texts. It envisions and seeks to prepare for a new era of liturgical renewal. And I think this is something that we should keep in mind, that it's just not a matter of using different prayers, but it deepening our own understanding of the liturgy, and as a result of that, hopefully leading to the fact that more and more Catholics not only participate more actively, but more and more Catholics participate in the Eucharist. Okay, those are just a few words of general introduction